So you know lots of things. You know names, dates, places, whether it's the store down the street or the location of New York City. You know facts about math, science, history. For instance, you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States. But did you ever stop to ask yourself how you know things? How did you come to know these things? How did you come upon these beliefs about the way the world is? And this question really serves as the basis of an important branch of philosophy called epistemology. Which epistemology is the study of how we know things. Now, epistemology is really interesting, and it tells us a lot. It can tell us a lot about the world. And the basic idea is that there are bunches of different truth claims out there, right? For instance, the claim that George Washington was the first president of the United States and George Washington was not the first president of the United States. Those are two truth claims. And our job as knowers, as human beings who know things, is to figure out what claims are true and which ones are false, so that we can have as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs as possible. So when you ask yourself, how do you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States, right? When you ask yourself, how did you choose between these two claims? You might say, well, authority. My parents, my teachers, my textbooks, all the reliable historians, they all tell me that George Washington was, in fact, the first president of the United States, that claim about the world is a true one. And so if you answer that way, then that makes the idea of authority, your criteria. And your criteria is basically the reason you give for a certain fact of information. You can think of criteria as a measuring stick or maybe a scale, and you use it to evaluate different facts and figure out which ones are true and which ones are false. And we have lots of different criteria. The laws of logic, or common sense, or your own senses. All of these things can serve as criteria. But now we have a problem. You see, if we're thinking of criteria as a measuring stick or a scale, then the question becomes, how do I know that that measuring stick or that scale is reliable? After all, if I'm measuring something but my stick is crooked, then I'm not going to come up with a true measurement. In the same way, if our criteria isn't trustworthy, we won't actually get a true belief. So how do I know that my criteria is in fact trustworthy? Well, I could give a criteria. I could give a reason for why I think my criteria is trustworthy. But what about that criteria, right? What about the criteria for the criteria for the criteria? How do I know that that's trustworthy? See, what we end up having is an infinite regress of criteria. It's an infinite number of reasons for why we believe things. But the human mind can't have an infinite number of reasons. We're just not capable of that. Instead, we need to have a starting point, an assumption, something that we start with in our search for knowledge. This, then, is the problem of the criteria, the question of where do we start? And there are two answers to this question. And these two answers kind of date back basically to the beginning of philosophy as a discipline with the Greeks. And the first answer, the first position, is particularism, and the second is Methodism. Now, don't get this confused with the Christian denomination. It's a very different thing. Methodism says that we start our starting assumption is with the criteria or a method for how we know things, right? That's how it got its name of Methodism. So in the example of whether or not George Washington was the first president of the United States, a Methodist would say that we start by assuming that authority is basically trustworthy. We would start with that assumption, and then we would say, okay, these authorities tell me that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that he was, in fact, the first president of the United States. Now, particularism, on the other hand, says that we don't start with methods, we don't start with a criteria. Instead, we start with certain items of knowledge, right? We start with the particulars. Now, these particulars are could be lots of different things. For instance, I exist. That's a common example of an item of knowledge that we seem to simply know. But let's use it again on this George Washington example. If a particularist would say that I start with the assumption that George Washington was the first president of the United States. I simply happen to know that. And then I look around and I say, all of these different authorities tell me that George Washington was the first president of the United States, which is an item of knowledge I already know. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that these authorities are generally trustworthy. And so I can then use those authorities to figure out other facts of information. For instance, that Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War. That's the method, that's the way particularism works. Now, both of these answers to the question of the criteria have their own problems. For instance, with Methodism, nobody can really agree on what methods we start with, right? You would think if Methodism were true, that everyone would have a couple of criteria or a couple of methods that we agree are properly basic, right? That we all just assume. But those don't seem to exist. On the other hand, particularism, well, it gives us maybe a little more universal way of working. There's more agreement on what facts we would all assume. It doesn't necessarily give us very strong reasons for those facts in the end, right? There's just some shaky ground there when we get down to it. And so, but both of them have their strengths, right? Both of them answer the weaknesses that the other side has. And so there's really no way to answer this question definitively. Like I said, these two positions have been around since philosophy first became a discipline. And so there's no way that probably you or I is ever going to provide a definitive answer for whether Methodism or particularism is correct. However, now you understand the problem of the criterion. Now you understand the two sides, and hopefully you can now draw your own conclusion. However, when you do, watch out. If you say that Methodism is true, but you started by assuming certain particular items of knowledge, well, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. I hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you guys all in the next video.